It was an early Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the world seemed to move just a little slower. The city was still wrapped in the gentle stillness of dawn, the streets almost empty except for the occasional early commuter or delivery truck rumbling by. A faint mist hung in the air, giving everything a dreamlike quality. Officer Mike Thompson leaned back in his patrol car, sipping on lukewarm coffee as he prepared for another routine day on the job. For the most part, these mornings were predictable. The streets he patrolled rarely saw much excitement at this hour. Maybe a car parked in the wrong spot, or someone rushing to work with one too many speeding violations. But today was different. As Mike turned onto a quiet residential street, something caught his attention. Up ahead, a garbage truck sat parked at an odd angle, its flashing lights casting an orange glow that pulsed faintly against the rows of parked cars and neatly trimmed hedges. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. Most garbage collection trucks were already on their routes by this hour, sticking to tight schedules that left little room for error. Mike squinted at the truck, trying to figure out what was wrong. The driver's side door was open, and the man inside was slumped forward slightly, his movements slow and deliberate, as if something was weighing him down. For a brief moment, Mike wondered if the man might be injured or worse, sick. He set his coffee cup down and adjusted his hat. Probably just another rough morning, he muttered to himself, though his gut told him it could be something more. Grabbing his notepad and stepping out of the patrol car, Mike walked cautiously toward the truck. The faint hum of the truck's engine was the only sound in the quiet street as Mike approached. He noticed the man climbing out of the driver's seat, moving slowly as if each step required effort. His uniform was worn and smudged, stained with the marks of hard, physical labor. The sleeves were rolled up to reveal weathered arms, and his boots scuffed the pavement with the heavy tread of someone used to long, grueling hours. At first glance, the man didn't seem out of the ordinary. To Mike, he looked like any other garbage collector, someone who worked a tough, thankless job that most people rarely noticed. But as the man stepped fully into view, there was something about him that made Mike pause. It wasn't his posture, which was slightly stooped as if from years of hauling heavy loads. Nor was it his face, which bore the telltale lines of age and hard work. No, it was his eyes. Piercing blue and startlingly clear, they seemed out of place on someone who otherwise blended so seamlessly into the background. For a moment, Mike felt a strange sense of familiarity, though he couldn't place it. He shook off the feeling and spoke up, his tone firm but not unkind. "Morning, sir. Everything all right here?" The man straightened slightly, brushing his hands on his uniform as he turned to face the officer. "Morning, officer," he replied in a voice that was deep and steady, carrying a calmness that didn't match the situation. "Just needed a quick breather. It's been a long shift." Mike glanced at the truck, noting the company logo faded on the side and the stack of neatly tied garbage bags in the back. Everything looked in order, but something still didn't sit right with him. "This your usual route?" Mike asked, keeping his tone casual but watchful. The man nodded slowly, though there was a brief hesitation before he answered. "Yeah, give or take a few streets. Sometimes they shuffle things around last minute." Mike tilted his head, studying him more closely. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about the man's appearance, but there was an air of something unspoken, something just beneath the surface. His uniform was clean enough, but it fit loosely, as though it had been borrowed or wasn't his usual size. And then there were those eyes, sharp, alert, and oddly familiar. "Got some ID on you?" Mike asked, his voice taking on a more authoritative edge. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, handing over a driver's license. Mike glanced at the name, Joseph Harrington. The name stirred something in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He handed the ID back and gestured toward the truck. "You're parked a little off course. Everything okay with the truck?" Joseph glanced over his shoulder at the vehicle, then back at Mike. "She's a little old, but she gets the job done," he said with a small smile. "Sometimes you just have to pull over and give her a minute to cool down." Mike nodded slowly, though he still felt an odd tension in the air. Joseph's responses were polite, almost rehearsed, as if he had been through similar conversations many times before. "Mind if I take a closer look?" Mike asked, gesturing toward the truck. Joseph shrugged, stepping aside with an air of indifference. "Go ahead. She's not hiding anything." As Mike walked around the truck, he noticed small details that didn't quite add up. The truck was too clean for a vehicle that spent its days collecting garbage. The cab, though cluttered with the usual paperwork and tools, was organized to the point of meticulousness. But it wasn't just the truck that puzzled Mike. It was Joseph himself. There was something about the way he carried himself, something about his tone and posture, that didn't fit the image of a simple garbage collector. He moved with an ease and confidence that suggested he was used to being in control, used to being in charge. "You said this is your usual route?" Mike asked again, hoping to catch him off guard. Joseph nodded, his expression calm and unbothered. "That's right. Been doing it for a few months now." "A few months?" Mike repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't sound like someone who's been in this line of work for long." Joseph chuckled softly, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to carry layers of meaning. "Life has a funny way of taking you places you never expected, officer." Mike frowned, his curiosity growing. There was something about Joseph Harrington that didn't add up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled onto something far more interesting than a routine patrol stop. Mike wasn't sure what it was about Joseph Harrington, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the man carried himself, calm and unbothered, like someone who had nothing to prove. Or maybe it was the subtle pauses in his answers, as though he were weighing every word before he spoke. Either way, Mike wasn't ready to let this go just yet. "Funny how life works, huh?" Mike said, crossing his arms and leaning against the side of the truck. He kept his tone casual, but his eyes stayed fixed on Joseph. "So, where were you before this? You don't look like someone who's spent years driving one of these." Joseph chuckled, his laugh low and steady. "Let's just say I've had my share of jobs. Some more glamorous than others." "Uh-huh," Mike replied, not entirely satisfied. He shifted his weight, glancing again at the ID Joseph had handed him. Harrington. The name tugged at his memory like a loose thread. He knew he'd heard it somewhere before, but the connection remained just out of reach. "You local?" Mike asked, fishing for more information. "Born and raised," Joseph said with a nod. "Moved around a bit, but I always find my way back." Mike nodded thoughtfully, though the answers weren't doing much to ease his suspicions. If anything, they only raised more questions. Joseph didn't seem nervous. In fact, he seemed almost too comfortable, like a man with nothing to hide but plenty to keep to himself. "Well," Mike said, deciding to shift gears, "you're parked in a bit of a tricky spot here. Mind if I take a look around the truck?" "Just standard procedure." Joseph's expression didn't falter. "Be my guest," he said, gesturing toward the vehicle. "Nothing to hide." Mike took his time walking around the truck, his sharp eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The tires were in good condition, the equipment neatly stowed, and the garbage bags in the back were securely tied. It all seemed normal enough, almost too normal. But as Mike moved toward the cab, he noticed something that gave him pause. There, tucked into the corner of the dashboard, was a small photograph in a simple black frame. It showed a much younger Joseph, dressed in a sharp suit and standing in front of what looked like a government building. Mike's brow furrowed as he leaned closer, studying the photo. Joseph looked completely different in the picture, clean-shaven, confident, and undeniably professional. There was something striking about the image, something that seemed to clash with the man standing in front of him now. "That's an interesting picture," Mike said, stepping back and motioning toward the cab. "Mind telling me about it?" Joseph's eyes flickered toward the truck, and for the first time, Mike thought he saw a hint of hesitation. It was brief, barely there, but it was enough to confirm that this wasn't just a routine stop. "Just an old memory," Joseph said with a shrug. "Nothing worth talking about." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Looks like more than just a memory to me." "You were in politics, weren't you?" Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up to adjust his cap, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "A long time ago. That life's behind me now." "Is that so?" Mike pressed, his curiosity piqued. "What made you leave?" Joseph's lips curled into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I learned some lessons the hard way. Decided it was time for a change." Mike studied him for a moment, weighing his words. It wasn't unusual for people to switch careers, but going from politics to garbage collection? That wasn't exactly a common path. "Fair enough," Mike said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He tapped his pen against his notepad, debating his next move. On one hand, Joseph hadn't done anything wrong, at least, not that Mike could prove. But on the other hand, there was something about this man that didn't sit right. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Harrington," Mike said finally. Joseph chuckled again, the sound low and almost amused. "Life's full of surprises, officer. You just have to roll with them." Mike couldn't argue with that, but he wasn't ready to let the conversation end. "You mind if I run your ID through the system? Just to make sure everything's in order." "Go ahead," Joseph said without hesitation. "I've got nothing to hide." Mike nodded and walked back to his patrol car, his mind racing as he entered Joseph's information into the database. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, maybe a few traffic tickets, or a record of employment with the sanitation department. But when the results popped up on the screen, Mike's jaw tightened. Joseph Harrington wasn't just a former politician, he was a retired state senator. A man who had once held significant power and influence, only to vanish from the public eye nearly a decade ago. The database didn't provide much detail, but it was enough to confirm Mike's suspicions. There was far more to Joseph Harrington than met the eye. Mike leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Why would a man like Joseph end up driving a garbage truck? What could have happened to make him walk away from a life of power and prestige? And why was he so calm, so composed, as though none of this mattered anymore? As Mike stepped out of the patrol car and walked back toward Joseph, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Mike stood there, clipboard in hand, waiting for Joseph Harrington to hand over his license and ID. The request was standard procedure, but something about the moment felt heavier than usual. The faint hum of the garbage truck's engine filled the silence as Joseph reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Here you go, officer," he said, his voice steady as he passed the card over. Mike glanced at the ID, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read the name, Joseph Harrington. There it was again, that nagging feeling of recognition. The name rang a faint bell, though he couldn't immediately place where he'd heard it before. For now, he pushed the thought aside. "This isn't the right route for this truck," Mike said, his tone firm but not accusatory. Joseph met his gaze without flinching. "Things don't always follow the rules, officer. But I'm sure you know that." It was a polite response, but there was something in the way Joseph said it that made Mike pause. His words were carefully chosen, almost deliberate, and they carried a subtle weight, as if he were hinting at something deeper, something unspoken. Mike frowned, not liking the ambiguity. "Look," he pressed, his voice a notch more authoritative, "I get that this might just be a mix-up, but rules are rules. I'm going to have to report this. Joseph didn't argue. He didn't bristle or lash out like some people might have in this situation. Instead, he stood there, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. It was unnerving. Most people would show at least some sign of discomfort or frustration, but Joseph acted as though he'd been through this sort of thing 100 times before. "You do what you need to do, officer," Joseph said with a faint nod. "I'm just here doing my job." Mike's grip tightened slightly on the clipboard. The man's calmness was almost unsettling. It wasn't arrogance, there was no hint of smugness in Joseph's demeanor, but there was a quiet confidence that suggested he was no stranger to confrontation. "I'm going to need to ask you a few more questions," Mike said, glancing down at the ID again. "How long have you been working this route?" Joseph tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "A few months," he said finally. "Give or take?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "A few months. And you're already comfortable enough to start changing up the route?" Joseph's lips curved into a small, tired smile. "Sometimes the job calls for flexibility, officer. You learn to adapt." Mike wasn't satisfied with the answer. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied Joseph more intently. There was something about this man, something in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, that didn't quite fit the image of a garbage collector. "You've got a pretty smooth way of talking for someone in this line of work," Mike said, testing the waters. "You been doing this kind of thing long?" Joseph chuckled softly, the sound low and almost amused. "Long enough to know the ins and outs," he replied. "That's so?" Mike pressed. Joseph nodded, his expression calm and unwavering. "That's so." The calmness was starting to wear on Mike's nerves. Most people, when pressed, would show at least a flicker of irritation or defensiveness. But not Joseph. He stood there like a man who had nothing to hide, or maybe, Mike thought, like a man who was very good at hiding things. Mike decided to push a little harder. "You seem awfully comfortable, Mr. Harrington. Most folks would be a bit more on edge in this situation." Joseph's smile didn't waver. "Life's too short to get worked up over the little things," he said simply. Mike let out a small breath, his frustration mounting. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. Most of the time, a firm tone and a few pointed questions were enough to get people to open up. But Joseph was like a stone wall, calm, unshakable, and frustratingly unreadable. "All right," Mike said, his tone sharpening slightly. "If there's nothing to hide, then you won't mind if I take a closer look at the truck?" Joseph shrugged, stepping aside with an air of indifference. "Be my guest." Mike climbed up onto the truck's side platform, his eyes scanning the interior. Everything seemed in order. The dashboard was cluttered with the usual items you'd expect in a work truck: a clipboard, a half-empty water bottle, a small stack of papers. The garbage bags in the back were neatly tied, and the equipment was stowed properly. But it was the photograph on the dashboard that caught his attention again. The same image he'd noticed earlier: a younger Joseph Harrington, dressed in a sharp suit, standing in front of what looked like a government building. "Interesting picture," Mike said, stepping back down from the truck. "Mind telling me about it?" Joseph's eyes flicked toward the truck, and for the first time, Mike thought he saw a brief flicker of something: hesitation, maybe. It was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same calm expression Joseph had worn throughout their conversation. "Just an old memory," Joseph said, his tone steady. "Nothing worth talking about." Mike wasn't buying it. "You sure about that? Looks like you were somebody important back in the day." Joseph's lips twitched into a faint smile. "We're all somebody important to someone, officer." "That's not what I meant, and you know it," Mike shot back. "What were you? A businessman? A lawyer?" Joseph didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his cap, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Let's just say I've had my share of titles. None of them matter now." Mike frowned, his curiosity growing. Joseph wasn't giving him much, but what little he was offering only made Mike more determined to figure out who this man really was. "All right, Mr. Harrington," Mike said, his tone a mix of authority and suspicion. "I'm going to run your ID. Just sit tight." Joseph nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take your time, officer. I'm not going anywhere." As Mike walked back to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something bigger than a simple route violation. The way Joseph spoke, the way he carried himself, it all pointed to a man who was far more than he appeared to be. When he entered Joseph's information into the database, the results confirmed what his instincts had been telling him all along. Joseph Harrington wasn't just an ordinary garbage collector. He was a retired state senator, a man who had once held power and influence, only to disappear from the public eye nearly a decade ago. Mike leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Why would someone like Joseph Harrington end up driving a garbage truck? And why was he so calm, so composed, as though none of this mattered? When Mike stepped out of the patrol car and walked back toward Joseph, he knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary stop. As Mike approached Joseph again, clipboard in hand, he couldn't shake the weight of what he'd just discovered. A retired state senator driving a garbage truck? It didn't add up. People like Joseph didn't just fade into obscurity without a reason. Mike cleared his throat as he stopped in front of the man. "So, Mr. Harrington," he began, keeping his tone neutral, "you've got an interesting past." Joseph raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I take it you ran my ID," he said simply. "Standard procedure," Mike replied, though he knew it was far more than that now. "You left out a pretty significant detail about your background. Former state senator, huh?" Joseph's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. "That was a long time ago, officer. Doesn't mean much these days." Mike crossed his arms, his curiosity piqued even further. "I'd say it means plenty. Senators don't just vanish into thin air, let alone end up working a job like this." "What happened?" Joseph's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes: regret, maybe, or something deeper. "Let's just say life doesn't always go the way you plan," he said after a moment. Mike frowned. "That's not much of an answer." "It's the only one I've got," Joseph replied, his tone quiet but firm. Mike could feel the frustration building in his chest. This man was a puzzle, and every answer only seemed to raise more questions. "You realize how strange this looks, right?" he pressed. "A guy like you, with your history, driving a garbage truck in the middle of nowhere." Joseph shrugged, the motion casual. "What can I say? Life's funny like that." Mike narrowed his eyes. "Funny, huh? Funny enough that you're avoiding a straight answer." Joseph sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Look, officer, I appreciate your concern. Really, I do. But my past is just that, the past. It doesn't matter anymore." "Maybe not to you," Mike countered, "but I think it might matter to a lot of other people." Joseph didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked out toward the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to pierce the morning haze. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost reflective. "Do you know what it's like to have everything you've worked for crumble in an instant?" he asked, not looking at Mike. Mike blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I can't say I do," he admitted. Joseph nodded slowly, as if that was the answer he'd expected. "It changes you," he said quietly. "Makes you see the world differently. Sometimes, it makes you want to disappear." Mike watched him carefully, his earlier frustration fading into something closer to sympathy. There was a weight to Joseph's words, a heaviness that spoke of pain and loss. Whatever this man had been through, it was clear that it had left its mark. "I get that you've been through a lot," Mike said after a moment. "But disappearing doesn't make the past go away. And it doesn't stop people from asking questions." Joseph turned to face him, his blue eyes sharp and piercing. "Maybe I don't want it to go away," he said. "Maybe I just want to live my life without it defining me." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but he hesitated. What could he say to that? He wasn't sure he had the right to judge a man like Joseph Harrington, a man who had clearly seen more of life's hardships than he let on. Still, Mike wasn't ready to let the matter drop. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose threads. He glanced back at the truck, then at Joseph. "You're not giving me much to work with here," he said finally. "But I'm not letting this go. Not yet." Joseph's faint smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't think you would," he said simply. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick and palpable. Mike could feel the weight of his own curiosity pressing down on him, driving him to dig deeper, to uncover the truth about the man standing before him. But before he could say anything else, the crackle of his radio broke the silence. "Officer Thompson, do you copy?" Mike sighed, lifting the radio to his mouth. "Go ahead," he said, his eyes still on Joseph. "We've got a situation down on Main Street. Need you to check it out." Mike hesitated, glancing between the radio and Joseph. Part of him wanted to stay, to keep pressing until he got the answers he was looking for. But duty called, and he couldn't ignore it. "Copy that," he said into the radio. "I'm on my way." He lowered the radio and looked back at Joseph, his expression serious. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "I'll be back." Joseph nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'll be here." As Mike turned and walked back to his patrol car, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't just a routine encounter, it was the beginning of something much bigger. As he drove away, his mind raced with questions. Who was Joseph Harrington, really? What had happened to make him leave behind a life of power and influence? And why was he so determined to keep the past buried? Mike didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. Mike leaned against his patrol car, waiting for the background check to come through. He kept one eye on Joseph, who had returned to wiping down the garbage truck as though this were any other day. The man's calmness continued to gnaw at Mike. Most people would fidget, glance around nervously, or make excuses to speed things up. Not Joseph. He moved with a steady rhythm, his expression relaxed, almost serene. "You've got a tough job, officer." "I respect that," Joseph said suddenly, breaking the silence. He didn't look up from his work, his voice casual but carrying a note of sincerity. Mike raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the comment. "You speak like someone who's been on the other side of this batch." Joseph chuckled softly, his laughter low and tinged with the weight of memories. "You could say that," he replied. "Life has a way of humbling you." Before Mike could press him further, the crackle of his radio interrupted the moment. "Officer Thompson, this is dispatch," the voice called out. Mike brought the radio to his mouth. "Go ahead." The dispatch officer's tone was professional but carried a hint of curiosity. "The truck's registration checks out, but I recommend running a background check on the driver. Something about this doesn't feel right." Mike frowned, his instincts aligning with the dispatcher's unease. "Copy that," he said, lowering the radio. He glanced at Joseph, who appeared entirely unbothered. The man leaned against the truck now, arms crossed, as if he had all the time in the world. "You don't seem too worried about this background check," Mike said, his tone probing. Joseph shrugged. "Why would I be? You'll find what you're looking for." Or maybe you won't. Mike narrowed his eyes. That sounds like a man who's hiding something. Joseph met his gaze, his piercing blue eyes steady. Or maybe it's the words of a man who knows how the game is played, he said quietly. The words hung in the air, their meaning ambiguous. Mike couldn't tell if Joseph was being cryptic on purpose or if this was just how the man spoke. Either way, it was frustrating. Moments later, the radio crackled again. Officer Thompson, I've got the background check results on Joseph Harrington, the dispatcher said. Mike straightened up. Go ahead. There was a brief pause, and when the dispatcher spoke again, her tone was noticeably different, more cautious, almost incredulous. You're not going to believe this. Joseph Harrington is a former state senator. Served 2 terms about 10 years ago. No criminal record, but he stepped down suddenly and hasn't been in the public eye since. He's clean, but, it's odd. What's a guy like that doing driving a garbage truck? Mike didn't respond immediately. He glanced at Joseph, who was now leaning back against the truck, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was as if he already knew what the dispatcher had said, as if he were waiting for Mike to piece it all together. Thanks, dispatch, Mike said finally, his voice steady despite the swirl of questions in his mind. I'll handle it from here. He clipped the radio back onto his belt and took a step toward Joseph. Former state senator, huh? Guess that explains the suit in the picture on your dashboard. Joseph didn't deny it. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression calm. That's right, he said simply. Mike folded his arms. You didn't think that was worth mentioning earlier? Joseph shrugged. You didn't ask. Mike let out a small, incredulous laugh. That's one way to look at it. But I've got to say, it's not every day you see a man go from politics to driving a garbage truck. Care to explain? Joseph's faint smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. It's a long story, officer. And not one I'm sure you want to hear. Try me, Mike said, his tone firm. Joseph studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether to answer. Finally, he sighed. You ever hear the phrase, the higher you climb, the harder you fall? Mike nodded. I've heard it. What does that have to do with you? Joseph's gaze shifted to the horizon, his expression distant. I climbed high. Too high, maybe. And when I fell, well, let's just say it wasn't pretty. Mike frowned, sensing there was more to the story. That's pretty vague for a guy who used to make a living giving speeches. Joseph chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. Fair enough, he said. I made some choices I thought were right at the time. But politics is a messy business. You make enemies without even trying. And sometimes, those enemies don't stop until they've taken everything from you. Mike watched him carefully, trying to read between the lines. So, what happened? Scandal? Corruption? Blackmail? Joseph shook his head. Nothing that simple. I fought for what I believed in. I stood up to people who wanted to take advantage of the system. And for a while, I thought I was winning. But, Mike prompted. But I underestimated how far some people would go to protect their interests, Joseph said quietly. They didn't just want me out of office, they wanted me destroyed. My reputation, my career, my family, they took it all. Mike felt a pang of sympathy despite himself. He'd dealt with plenty of people who had excuses for their mistakes, but Joseph didn't sound like he was making excuses. He sounded like a man who had been through hell and come out the other side, scarred but still standing. And the garbage truck? Mike asked after a moment. Joseph smiled faintly. It's honest work, he said. After everything I lost, I needed to rebuild. Start fresh. This job might not be glamorous, but it's real. No lies, No politics, just hard work and a paycheck at the end of the week. Mike nodded slowly, his earlier suspicion giving way to a grudging respect. That's quite a story, he said. Joseph met his gaze, his expression serious. It's not just a story, officer. It's my life. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension between them had shifted, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. Mike could see the pain in Joseph's eyes, the weight of everything he'd been through. And for the first time, he began to understand why the man carried himself with such calmness. You know, Mike said finally, most people in your position would be bitter. Angry. Joseph nodded. I was, for a long time. But anger doesn't fix anything. It just eats you alive. Mike considered his words, then gave a small nod. Fair enough, he said. As he turned to head back to his patrol car, he glanced over his shoulder. Stay out of trouble, Mr. Harrington. Something tells me you've had enough of it for one lifetime. Joseph chuckled softly. You're not wrong about that, officer. You're not wrong at all. This section now runs significantly longer, adding depth and details to the interaction, steadily building intrigue around Joseph's past and his present life. Would you like me to continue expanding or transition into the climax and big reveal? Mike climbed back into his patrol car, but his mind was far from settled. Something about Joseph Harrington lingered in the air like the faint smell of rain before a storm. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring at the man who had once walked the marble halls of power but now stood in a soiled uniform beside a garbage truck. Joseph was back to his task, calmly inspecting the side mirrors of the truck as if their conversation hadn't happened. He had the air of someone who had long ago come to terms with his circumstances, but Mike couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something left unsaid. The radio crackled again, snapping Mike out of his thoughts. Thompson, what's your status? It was the dispatcher, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. All clear, Mike replied, glancing at Joseph through the windshield. But I think I just ran into the most interesting man I've ever met. The dispatcher chuckled faintly. You mean the ex-senator? Yeah, I read up on him while you were checking the truck. He was a rising star back in the day, clean record, big reforms, lots of press. Then, out of nowhere, he resigns. Rumors swirled for months, but nothing ever stuck. People said he just disappeared. Mike tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, her words echoing his own unease. Well, he's reappeared. Right here, driving garbage routes. You going to let it go? She asked, the question laced with curiosity. Mike didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched as Joseph climbed into the truck, adjusted his seat, and started the engine. The sound of the heavy vehicle rumbling to life seemed to snap Mike out of his thoughts. Yeah, he said finally, though even as he said it, he wasn't entirely sure he meant it. I'll let it go. The dispatcher's voice was teasing. You're too curious for that, Thompson. Mike smirked, shaking his head. Just get me my next call, he said, signing off. Joseph's truck pulled away slowly, its tail lights glowing red as it merged back onto the road. Mike watched it go, a part of him wanting to follow. But instead, he turned his car in the opposite direction and continued his patrol, the encounter still fresh in his mind. The rest of the day passed without much excitement, but Joseph's words lingered in Mike's thoughts like an unsolved riddle. By the time his shift ended, he couldn't resist the pull of curiosity any longer. Sitting in the quiet of his small apartment, he booted up his old laptop and started searching. It didn't take long to find articles about Joseph Harrington. His name popped up in headlines from over a decade ago: reformer on the rise, Joseph Harrington pushes anti-corruption bill, Harrington's bold vision for healthcare reform, state senator resigns amidst sudden controversy, no comment from office. Mike clicked on the last headline, his interest piqued. The article was frustratingly vague, filled with speculation but no hard facts. Some sources claimed Harrington had been forced out by political enemies, others hinted at a family scandal. But there were no charges, no damning evidence, just a sudden and unexplained departure. Mike leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What happened to you, Harrington?" he muttered under his breath. He kept digging, clicking through page after page of search results. Eventually, he stumbled upon a blog post written by a retired journalist. The title caught his eye: "The Fall of Joseph Harrington, a Political Hit Job." The blog detailed an intricate web of political rivalries, suggesting that Harrington had been targeted for his efforts to root out corruption. According to the author, Harrington's resignation had been the result of a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by powerful figures who stood to lose if his reforms succeeded. The blog hinted at threats, backroom deals, and even whispers of blackmail, but, again, no concrete evidence. Mike closed the laptop with a sigh, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in his mind. If the blog was right, Harrington had been a man who tried to do the right thing and paid the price for it. But why hadn't he fought back? Why had he disappeared instead of standing his ground? The next morning, Mike's routine felt oddly uneventful. He couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Joseph wasn't over. And, as fate would have it, he was right. Around midday, Mike was parked near a construction site, sipping coffee and filling out paperwork, when he saw it again, the same garbage truck, rolling slowly down the street. And there, in the driver's seat, was Joseph Harrington. Mike set his coffee aside and started his car, pulling onto the road to follow the truck. He kept a reasonable distance, watching as Joseph made his rounds. The truck stopped at a small diner, and Joseph climbed out, carrying a trash bag over his shoulder. Mike parked a few spaces away and stepped out of his car. "Harrington," he called, his voice carrying across the lot. Joseph turned, his expression unreadable but not surprised. "Officer Thompson," he said with a small nod. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." Mike walked over, his hands on his hips. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday. About life humbling you. I did some digging." Joseph's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't look angry, just resigned. "I figured you might," he said. "You were a good man, Harrington," Mike said, his tone serious. "You did good work. So why'd you let them push you out?" Joseph sighed, setting the trash bag down. He leaned against the truck, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Because sometimes, doing the right thing isn't enough," he said quietly. "Sometimes, the fight isn't worth what it costs." Mike frowned. "That sounds like an excuse." Joseph met his gaze, his expression sharp. "It's not an excuse, officer. It's a reality. I lost everything trying to do the right thing. My career, my reputation, my family, all of it gone. And for what? So a few headlines could call me a hero? So I could become a martyr for a cause no one cared about in the end." Mike didn't know how to respond. He could hear the pain in Joseph's voice, the bitterness that came from years of carrying a burden no one else understood. Before Mike could say anything, a voice called out from the diner. "Hey, Joe. You coming in or what?" Mike turned to see a young woman standing in the doorway, her apron stained from a morning of work. She waved at Joseph with a warm smile, completely at ease. Joseph waved back. "Be right there," he called. "She runs this place," Joseph explained to Mike. "Good kid. Reminds me that not everything's bad in this world." Mike watched the interaction, a small piece of the puzzle falling into place. Joseph might have lost everything, but he hadn't given up entirely. He'd found a new purpose, a simpler life, away from the chaos that had once consumed him. "Maybe you're right," Mike said finally. "Maybe the fight wasn't worth what it cost. But if you're not bitter, Harrington, Then why do I get the feeling you're not done fighting? Joseph smiled faintly, his piercing blue eyes filled with a quiet determination. Because some battles don't end, officer. They just change shape. This continuation builds on the tension and slowly peels back more layers of Joseph's past, his decisions, and his philosophy, all while keeping Mike's curiosity and skepticism alive. Let me know if you'd like this expanded further. Mike stared at Joseph, his mind reeling. He hadn't expected this. A former senator, one of the most influential figures in the state just a decade ago, now picking up garbage and blending into the background of everyday life. It didn't add up. But, you could have done anything, Mike stammered, still trying to process it all. You could have started over, gone back to law, consulting, even politics. Why throw all that away to end up here? Joseph leaned on the garbage truck, crossing his arms as if he'd answered this question 100 times before. I didn't throw it away, officer. I gave it up. There's a difference. His tone was calm but resolute, each word weighted with meaning. When you've spent your life in a system that claims to serve the people but actually exploits them, you start to wonder if you're really helping at all. Mike frowned. So, what? You just walked away? That's not the Joseph Harrington people remember. Joseph's smirk faded, and a shadow of pain crossed his face. No, he admitted. The Joseph Harrington people remember was a man who thought he could change the world. Thought he could fight corruption with a handful of laws and a good speech. But the system doesn't work like that, officer. It eats people like me alive. Mike shifted uncomfortably, the weight of Joseph's words pressing down on him. But you didn't just lose your seat, he pressed. You disappeared. Nobody knew where you went or what happened to you. Joseph nodded, his gaze distant. I didn't disappear by accident. When the scandal hit fabricated, by the way, I had a choice: fight back and risk losing my family in the crossfire, or walk away and let the machine chew me up quietly. What was the scandal? Mike asked hesitantly. Joseph hesitated, then sighed. They said I was laundering campaign funds. It was a lie, of course, but it didn't matter. The headlines were enough. By the time I could clear my name, my wife had left, my kids were being harassed, and my colleagues had turned their backs on me. Mike's chest tightened. He had heard of smear campaigns before, but hearing it directly from someone who lived through one gave the concept a darker, more personal weight. That's why you left, Mike murmured. Joseph nodded. I wasn't going to let them destroy the people I cared about. So I resigned, took the fall, and disappeared. They thought they'd won. Mike tilted his head, confused. And now you're driving a garbage truck? How is that winning? Joseph chuckled softly, shaking his head. Because I'm free, officer. Free to live my life without playing their games. Free to help people in small but real ways. You'd be surprised how much you learn about a community from the trash they throw away. Mike blinked, taken aback. That sounds philosophical. It's practical, Joseph replied, his voice steady. When you're picking up trash, you see everything people try to hide. Bills they can't pay. Medicines they can't afford. Food they waste while their neighbors go hungry. It's a front row seat to the truth, officer. And I decided that if I couldn't change the world from the top, I'd try to make a difference from the bottom. Mike was silent for a long moment, his respect for the man growing with each word. So, all this time, you've been quietly helping people. Joseph shrugged again, his humility genuine. I do what I can. Sometimes it's just a kind word or an extra bag of groceries. Sometimes it's helping someone navigate a system that's designed to confuse them. It's not glamorous, but it's real. The moment hung heavy between them, the weight of Joseph's story settling in. Then, almost as if on cue, the radio crackled again. Thompson, you're still with Harrington, right? Get this, there's more. He's been anonymously donating to local shelters for years. Food banks, too. And there's a rumor he helped save that community center from being shut down. Mike looked at Joseph, who simply raised an eyebrow. I'm guessing you didn't want that getting out? Mike asked. Joseph shook his head. It's not about credit, officer. It's about doing the right thing, quietly. That's how you change things little by little, person by person. No headlines. No politics. Just people helping people. Mike felt a lump in his throat. He had started this encounter thinking he'd stumbled upon a simple traffic violation, and now he was standing in front of a man who had sacrificed everything to stay true to his principles. A man who had found a way to keep fighting, even after losing everything. Why tell me all this? Mike asked finally. Joseph met his gaze, his piercing blue eyes unwavering. Because you asked, he said simply. And because I think you might understand. Mike wasn't sure what Joseph meant by that, but something about the words resonated deeply. He thought about his own job, the long hours, the bureaucracy, the constant struggle to make a difference in a system that often felt stacked against him. Maybe, in a way, they weren't so different after all. You know, Mike said, breaking the silence, you could have told me to mind my own business. Could have just driven away. Joseph smiled faintly. And miss the chance to talk to someone who might still believe in doing the right thing? No, officer, I wasn't about to let that opportunity pass. Mike chuckled softly, shaking his head. You're something else, Harrington. So are you, Thompson, Joseph replied, his tone warm but serious. Don't let this job turn you into someone you're not. As Joseph climbed back into the truck, Mike stood by, watching him with a newfound respect. Take care, Harrington, he called out as the engine roared to life. You too, officer, Joseph replied, giving a small wave before pulling away. For a long time, Mike stood there, watching the truck disappear down the street. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. Maybe it was a reminder that even in a flawed system, there were still people trying to do good quietly, humbly, and without recognition. And maybe, just maybe, it was a sign that he needed to keep trying, too. Mike watched the garbage truck rumble down the road, the flashing hazard lights fading into the distance. Joseph's words echoed in his mind, humility is where true strength lies. It wasn't the kind of wisdom he'd expected to receive during his morning shift. It left a weighty impression, a gnawing question about his own role in a system he'd always tried to uphold. Back at the precinct, the conversation came up over coffee. You're telling me you met Joseph Harrington? The Joseph Harrington? Officer Reed asked, setting his mug down with a clink. Mike nodded. Yeah. The guy's driving a garbage truck now. Says it's his way of staying honest. Reed scoffed. Man, if I were him, I'd be on a beach somewhere sipping cocktails. What kind of person trades power for that? The kind who gets tired of the lies, Mike replied quietly, more to himself than to Reed. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of Mike. He dug into Joseph Harrington's history, combing through archived news articles and old footage. The scandal, once front-page material, now felt like a distant memory. The headlines were bold and damning: Senator Harrington accused of embezzlement. Political career in shambles amid allegations. But when Mike read further, he noticed something strange. There was no trial, no definitive evidence, just a cascade of accusations and resignations. The articles hinted at corporate donors withdrawing support and political rivals pouncing on the opportunity to discredit him. A later piece caught Mike's attention: Harrington maintains innocence, steps down for family's safety. The quote read, "I have always served with integrity, but protecting my family comes first. I will not allow them to suffer because of political games." Mike leaned back in his chair, his suspicion growing. Could Joseph have been set up? The more he read, the more it seemed likely. The accusations had come at the peak of a heated legislative battle over corporate tax reforms, a bill Joseph had championed, much to the disdain of powerful lobbyists. The next day, Mike decided to pay a visit to City Hall. The records office was quiet, its sterile walls lined with shelves of forgotten documents. After some digging, he found Joseph's final bill proposals, legislation that would have cracked down on corporate tax loopholes and increased funding for public programs. The proposed reforms had drawn sharp opposition from industries that stood to lose millions. Coincidence? Mike muttered under his breath, his frustration mounting. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to unravel the truth. Maybe it was guilt for having initially judged Joseph, or maybe it was the realization that the system he served wasn't as black and white as he'd believed. Over the next few weeks, Mike couldn't help but keep tabs on Joseph. He watched from a distance as the man went about his unassuming life, collecting garbage and chatting with locals. What stood out most was how people treated Joseph not as a disgraced politician but as a friend. He saw Joseph help an elderly woman fix her broken porch, deliver food to a struggling family, and even organize a small community cleanup event. One day, Mike approached Joseph after spotting him at a local diner. "You're still fighting, aren't you?" Mike asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Joseph smiled faintly, stirring his coffee. "The fight never ends, officer. It just changes shape. But why keep it quiet? Why not clear your name, go public, and expose the truth?" Mike pressed. Joseph shook his head. "Because the truth doesn't always need a spotlight to matter. What I do now might not make headlines, but it makes a difference. That's enough for me." Inspired by Joseph's story, Mike began looking deeper into the scandal. Quietly, and on his own time, he reached out to former colleagues of Joseph and started piecing together what really happened. The more he dug, the clearer it became: Joseph had been a victim of political sabotage, orchestrated by a coalition of corporate interests and opportunistic rivals. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a retired journalist who admitted under anonymity that their article had been heavily influenced by anonymous sources tied to Joseph's political opponents. It wasn't fair, the journalist admitted. But the pressure from upstairs was overwhelming. Fueled by this revelation, Mike contacted a local investigative reporter he trusted, handing over the evidence he'd collected. "This man deserves justice," he told her. The story broke weeks later, shaking the local political scene. Ex-Senator Harrington vindicated, "Evidence points to political sabotage." The report detailed how corporate lobbyists and political rivals had conspired to fabricate the scandal, effectively ending Joseph's career. Public outrage followed, with demands for accountability growing louder by the day. Mike expected Joseph to be relieved or even vindicated, but when he visited him to share the news, Joseph's reaction was subdued. "I appreciate what you did, officer," he said, his voice calm. "But I'm not going back to that life. It's not who I am anymore." "But don't you want justice?" Mike asked. Joseph smiled. "Justice isn't about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about making the world better, no matter how small the act. I've found my place in doing that quietly." The revelations about Joseph's past brought him unexpected attention. People who had once dismissed him as just another garbage collector now looked at him with admiration and gratitude. Some even approached him, apologizing for judging him based on the scandal. But Joseph remained humble, redirecting the attention toward the causes he cared about. He organized more community projects, brought neighbors together, and inspired others to step up and help where they could. Slowly but surely, his small acts of kindness began transforming the community. Mike often found himself reflecting on his encounter with Joseph. It changed the way he approached his own work, reminding him to look beyond appearances and question the systems he served. Years later, when Mike retired, he would tell the story of Joseph Harrington to younger officers, framing it not as a tale of redemption, but as one of resilience, humility, and the quiet power of doing what's right. And Joseph? He continued his work, not as a senator, but as a neighbor, a mentor, and a friend, a man who proved that true justice isn't about titles or headlines but about living with integrity, one small act at a time. The weeks following the exposé on Joseph Harrington brought ripples of change, but not in the way Mike had initially expected. Rather than bask in the limelight or seek revenge, Joseph stayed true to his character. The former senator continued his humble work, collecting garbage by day and working with local charities by night. His actions inspired quiet admiration within the community. The once dismissive glances turned into nods of respect. People whispered about his perseverance and integrity. Local businesses reached out, offering to sponsor some of the projects Joseph had initiated. A nearby youth center, struggling to stay afloat, found itself revitalized after Joseph mobilized volunteers to restore the building and fund programs for disadvantaged kids. Mike often dropped by, not in uniform but as a friend. The more he spent time with Joseph, the more he realized how deep the man's convictions ran. As the dust settled from the media's revelations, investigations into the corporate players behind Joseph's political downfall gained momentum. Public outrage demanded accountability, and several influential figures were indicted for fraud, bribery, and obstruction of justice. One day, Mike found himself reading a headline, "Former lobbyist turns witness, admits to framing Harrington." The article detailed a sordid web of deals made to ensure Joseph's proposed tax reforms would never see the light of day. Mike felt a surge of vindication on Joseph's behalf. He drove to find him, eager to share the news. When Mike pulled up beside Joseph's truck, the man was busy helping a young boy tie his shoelaces near a playground. "You've got to hear this," Mike said as Joseph approached. Joseph took the newspaper Mike handed him, his expression calm as he read. After a moment, he let out a small sigh. "It's good they're finally being held accountable," he said. "But justice isn't about making the guilty fall, it's about lifting the innocent." Joseph's focus remained on the community. He began hosting regular neighborhood meetings to address local concerns, everything from potholes to food insecurity. What started as small gatherings in the park soon grew into larger events, with more and more people eager to contribute. "You're doing more now than most politicians ever did," Mike commented during one such meeting. Joseph laughed. "It's easier to help people when you're not worried about re-election." The city began to notice the positive changes. Streets became cleaner, neighbors more connected. A small urban garden initiative spearheaded by Joseph not only provided fresh produce but also brought diverse groups together to work side by side. One evening, Mike received a call from City Hall. A council member had seen the impact Joseph was making and wanted to offer him a position as a community advisor. Excited, Mike drove straight to Joseph's modest home to share the news. Joseph listened patiently as Mike explained the offer. When Mike finished, Joseph smiled warmly. "I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not going back into politics." "Why not?" Mike asked, his frustration evident. "You've already proven your integrity. You'd have more resources, more influence." Joseph shook his head. "Influence isn't about titles, Mike. It's about trust. And I've earned more of that out here than I ever did in the Senate. Besides, I've seen what politics does to people. I'd rather stay where I can make real change, no strings attached." Over time, Joseph's efforts began to inspire similar movements in neighboring areas. Other communities adopted his grassroots approach, focusing on local solutions rather than waiting for distant officials to act. Joseph became a mentor to aspiring community leaders, always emphasizing the importance of humility and service. Mike, too, found himself changed. He approached his job differently, looking beyond the surface of every encounter. He began volunteering during his off hours, inspired by Joseph's dedication. Years later, When Mike retired, he started his own community outreach program, crediting Joseph Harrington as his inspiration. "One man taught me that justice isn't a courtroom, it's what we do for each other every day," he often said. One crisp autumn morning, the familiar sound of Joseph's garbage truck didn't echo through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly: Joseph had quietly retired from his job, leaving a simple note at the depot thanking his co-workers and wishing them well. Mike went to Joseph's house, only to find it empty. A neighbor mentioned seeing him drive off with a packed car. A month later, Mike received a postcard. It was from Joseph, showing a picturesque countryside. The message was short but heartfelt. "Dear Mike, I've moved on to quieter pastures, but my heart is always with the community we built. Remember, small acts create big waves. Keep doing good. Your friend, Joseph." Joseph's departure didn't mark the end of his influence. The community he left behind continued to thrive, guided by the principles he'd instilled. People who once dismissed their ability to make a difference now stepped up, driven by the memory of the man who had shown them how. Mike often found himself at the urban garden Joseph had helped start, surrounded by the laughter of children and the chatter of neighbors. Looking around, he realized Joseph's greatest legacy wasn't in the headlines or the scandals, but in the countless lives he'd touched. Years later, as Mike walked through the vibrant streets of the community that Joseph had helped transform, he couldn't help but smile. Joseph Harrington had taught him that true power didn't come from authority or wealth but from the willingness to serve others. Mike often shared Joseph's story, not as a tale of redemption but as a reminder of what it means to lead with humility. Sometimes, he would say, the strongest leaders are the ones who step down from the podium and roll up their sleeves. Joseph's story became a quiet legend, a testament to the idea that even the most unassuming acts of kindness could leave a lasting impact. And in the hearts of those who knew him, Joseph Harrington remained a symbol of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of doing what's right. As the garbage truck disappeared into the morning haze, Officer Mike Thompson leaned against his patrol car, his mind racing. The revelation about Joseph Harrington lingered like a soft echo. Who else, he wondered, carried untold stories beneath their unassuming lives? How many people, overlooked and dismissed, had depths of experience that could teach lessons no textbook ever could? Joseph wasn't a man defined by his fall from grace or his scandal. He was a man who had taken life's hardest blows and turned them into fuel for something greater. His story wasn't just about redemption, it was about reinvention, about finding a new purpose when the old one crumbled. For Mike, the encounter shifted something fundamental. As an officer, he was used to assessing people, quickly checking their papers, judging their actions, determining their intentions. But Joseph's calm demeanor and piercing words had shown him that the surface often hides more than it reveals. Every time Mike passed another garbage truck, another bus driver, or another figure clad in a worker's uniform, he paused to wonder, what journey brought them here? What choices had they made? What wisdom might they carry? Joseph's quiet wisdom didn't fade away after that day. The story spread, not through headlines or grand speeches, but through whispers exchanged in the neighborhoods he worked in. Parents told their children about the retired politician who had chosen to serve in the humblest way. Workers found inspiration in knowing someone like Joseph, who once wielded power in government, had chosen to walk among them as an equal. Small acts of kindness began to multiply in the community. A local bakery owner started donating unsold bread to a nearby shelter. Teens who once loitered aimlessly began volunteering to clean up parks. People began to see each other differently, not as roles or labels, but as complex individuals with hidden stories and unspoken struggles. One day, while visiting a community center Joseph had helped establish, Mike met an elderly woman named Clara. She had known Joseph for years and smiled warmly as she recounted his journey. "Joseph used to say something I'll never forget," she told Mike. "Humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less." He believed that real power didn't come from money or politics. It came from the way you treated the people around you. Mike nodded, her words resonating deeply. Joseph's choices weren't just a reflection of his character, they were a call to action for anyone willing to listen. Months turned into years, but Joseph's impact only grew. The community garden he'd helped create became a vibrant hub of activity. Neighbors who barely spoke before now shared seeds, advice, and laughter. The playground Joseph had quietly repaired bustled with children, their giggles a constant reminder of hope and renewal. Mike, now a sergeant, carried Joseph's lessons into his work. He trained younger officers to approach their jobs with compassion, to look past appearances, and to listen more than they spoke. Everyone you meet is carrying a story, he'd tell them. It's not your job to judge. It's your job to understand. One day, Mike received a letter in his mailbox. It was from Joseph. Dear Mike. By now, you've probably figured out why I never came back to politics. I've found my peace in the little things, helping a neighbor, planting a seed, or just listening. If I've learned anything, it's this: big changes don't come from speeches or laws. They come from people, from the quiet decisions we make every day to care for one another. Thanks for listening that day. I saw a lot of myself in you, someone who's willing to look beyond the obvious. Keep doing that, and you'll leave the world better than you found it. Your friend, Joseph *. Mike read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his wallet. He carried it with him on every shift, a small reminder of the lesson Joseph had left him: true leadership isn't about commanding respect, it's about earning it through kindness, integrity, and humility. When he retired years later, Mike often found himself visiting the community garden. The flowers bloomed brighter every year, a testament to the seeds Joseph had planted not just in the soil, but in the hearts of everyone who knew him. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet, unassuming tales of people like Joseph Harrington, people who don't seek recognition but change the world anyway, one small act at a time. And as Mike watched the sun set over the thriving garden, he smiled, knowing that Joseph's greatest legacy wasn't in his title or his past. It was in the lives he'd touched, the lessons he'd taught, and the seeds of hope he'd sown. Sometimes, Mike thought, the people you least expect turn out to be the greatest teachers of all.